As I'm sure you all know, our two institutions share common roots. Imperial College and the V&A both traced their roots back to the Great Exhibition of 1851. It was the great international showcase of British industrial design directed by Prince Albert, and by the way, a German, and Queen Victoria's husband. The Great Exhibition was hugely successful, and Prince Albert ensured that some of the profit it made were used to buy the land in South Kensington, which our two great institutions now occupy, along with the Science Museum, Natural History Museum, and a lot of other amazing institutions up and down Exhibition Road. Indeed, Albert's stamp on South Kensington was so great that the area became known as, for the Victorians, as Albertopolis. So I hope every one of us here this evening thinks of ourselves as grateful citizens of Albertopolis. Welcome. Now I'm here tonight to discuss the business of managing cultural institutions with you. But I want to begin by exploring a bit more of the organizational legacy of the V&A by Prince Albert, because it casts a very revealing light on some of the central dilemmas anyone running a cultural institution has to face. Right from the start, Prince Albert was always clear that he wanted all the institutions of Albertopolis to fulfill a very practical purpose. Now it's easy to see how great scientific institutions such as the Imperial College meets that aim. But what about the V&A? After all, what could be more impractical than a great treasure house filled with the art and artifacts of the world, far more than we can ever display at one time. More than 2.2 million objects in our storage facilities and on display. But in fact, the V&A was founded to fulfill just a practical purpose as the Imperial College. It was set up to showcase the best design the world had to offer, and to do so with a very functional purpose in mind, something I'll say a little bit more about it in a moment. As a very practical man himself, Prince Albert liked other practical men. That's why he chose as the first director of the V&A a man called Henry Cole. Indeed, whenever he had a pet scheme to launch, he would make what may be, the only joke Prince Albert ever made. "We need steam," he cried, "bring me coal." And Henry Cole would drop whatever he was doing and respond to Prince's command. Cole was a really remarkable man, a collector, a designer, children's author, inventor of the commercial Christmas card, instrumental in inventing the postal system, and a gifted administrator, manager as well. He, more than anyone, invented the V&A. He and Albert shared a vision. They wanted the museum to be democratic. We talk about mid-19th century, when a lot of revolutions were going on in Europe. Be democratic, open, accessible, a museum for everyone. They wanted to be a place that honored the past, but also saw the past essentially as a resource to inform the future. We still talk about the time when Karl Marx was sitting in the British Library and writing the Capital. They saw it as a proudly utilitarian and entrepreneurial endeavor, a place where designers would come to find inspiration, and where their customers would also come to have their eyes opened to the ways good design could improve their lives. In other words, they wanted the museum to have an explicit social dimension. And all of these things are still part of the DNA of this museum. But then something else happened. An entirely different strain entered the DNA of the V&A. Henry Cole needed help, and he hired the museum's first curator, a young man called John Charles Robinson. Robinson was a great man, and the museum owes him a great debt. But it turned out that his vision for the museum was completely different from the one espoused by Prince Albert and Henry Cole. Robinson saw the museum as a place where great collections of fine art could be built. His vision was of scholarship and connoisseurship. For Robinson, the past was not there as a resource to help design the future. It was there to be honored and investigated for its own sake. It was an aristocratic rather than a democratic approach, one that locked the past rather than the future. These two men worked uneasily together for years, until Robinson tried to get himself made director, and Cole had to kick him out, to talk about managing practice. Ever since then, there has been a tension at the heart of the V&A, a tension between these two strands of thought. One, democratic, open, engaged, looking to the future, and the other, aristocratic, scholarly, self-contained, essentially concerned with investigating the past. The job of all V&A directors is to manage that tension and to make from it something unequally fruitful. Indeed, this tension lies at the heart not just of museums, but all publicly funded cultural institutions. And it's a real tension, because the enduring question and underlying any consideration of the business of managing cultural institutions is this: can culture and management ever really fit together? Let's one moment to have a bit of water. So again, is culture and management somehow a contradiction? As you can imagine, as a museums director, I hope the answer is yes, it can fit together. It's not a contradiction. But sometimes I wonder, I'm not really sure. The problem is that if you are not careful, management becomes a way of taming things, people, ideas, processes, of making them predictable, of making them manageable. But the arts are, of their essence, untamable and unpredictable, or at least they are if they are any good. So what makes them worthwhile is also what makes them in some sense unmanageable. So, faced with this conundrum, what should people like me do? Well, I think the first thing is to be very clear about the appropriate benchmarks, about the right metrics of success for a cultural institution. And in particular, be clear about the balance you have to strike between metrics of quantity and metrics of quality. These are by no means the same thing. One of the key metrics of success for the V&A is the visitor numbers. I'm glad to say the numbers are on a rising trend. We tripled the amount of visitors in the last 10 years. We have the first time more than 3.3 million visitors this year. So it's definitely a very positive part of the development of the V&A. But I also know that if I give too much weight to this particular metric, then I may damage a more fundamental metric for the museum, which is the quality of what we do. For example, to say it in a very basic way, for example, I know that if we mount one kind of exhibition, then huge crowds of visitors will come. But if we mount another kind of exhibition, then visitor numbers are likely to be much smaller. I recommend to go on the internet and try to find information about the punk exhibition in the Metropolitan Museum that is open for I think 2 weeks now. It's a very streamlined exhibition. It's not cutting edge. It's a beautiful exhibition. It says a lot about couture. It says a lot about fashion design, but it doesn't explain what the basic idea of punk was in the time here when it started in London. So again, what will happen if we put smaller exhibition, if we put exhibition on display with smaller visitor numbers? And yet I may know in my heart that the small show will be much more important than the big one. Important that is, in terms of saying something new about our culture, about the creativity of challenging received wisdom, and by doing so advancing the frontiers of knowledge. Where should the balance lie here? Of course, the trick you want to pull is to do both. Stage a show that brings in huge numbers of visitors, but also hits the quality target. The David Bowie show we have on right now is a case point. It's broken all kinds of records. Who was at the Bowie show? Have you seen it already? Oh, wow. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Let's talk about that later. It's broken all the records, kinds of records for the visitor number, so it meets the quantity metric, meets it big times. I mean, if you give me just a second to explain what I mean. I think it's the completely unexpected that we face with that exhibition. Normally, you know when there's success somehow in the air. I built an exhibition in Dresden about 8 years ago, so-called Green Vault, and we arranged that success. We knew before that the success will come. The completely unforeseen exhibition, unforeseen success with the David Bowie show is when we had a press conference, I think it was last September or October, at 11 o'clock in the morning, and I mean, we announced the topic David Bowie, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, someone called me and said, your press kit is on eBay for £12. I think I never had that before. We have now fake tickets, fraud. This is normally something you have in football. If this is a benchmark, then I think we really made it. I mean, phone calls from all over the world. The exhibition will travel to Sao Paulo after London. I was in Sao Paulo 2 weeks ago. While I was there were phone calls, people calling from different parts, wherever they came from, and said, we couldn't make it to London. Can we reserve tickets now for Sao Paulo for next January? So whatever that is, just talking about now how you measure that success, whatever that is, it is just amazing and it's a surprise for us. But it's also a show that sets out not just to tell the Bowie story, but to explore that narrative with challenging content designed to make visitors stop and think. Stop and think about all kinds of things that are wrapped up in the David Bowie phenomenon, questions not just of music and style and design, but also of identity and zeitgeist. There's a school of management thinking that has its mantra in saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I think it was McKinsey, or was it KPMG? Or you can also say, if you can count it, you can change it. And I think there's a degree of truth in that. But how do you apply that approach to the David Bowie exhibition in a way that captures what makes it so powerful, compelling, and an exciting experience? We can measure the cues and the visitor demographics. We can measure the sponsorship that we've raised. We can measure the merchandise that we sold. But none of those comes close to the capturing the heart and soul of that show. For me, what makes it such a successful is the bit you can't measure, you cannot measure. The metrics of quality are by their nature fuzzy and imprecise. But in that fuzzy imprecision lies something very precious, and we need to guard it jealously. Quantitative metrics have a brilliant precision that qualitative metrics can never aspire to. But if you allow yourself to be dazzled by that brilliant precision, you can end up with slick and streamlined and brainwashed shows that draw crowds but offer no intellectual challenge. However, this is not to say that modern management methods have nothing to offer to a museum like the V&A. Far from it. There are plenty of things that you can measure in any museum, things that you should measure, and in doing so, to seek to manage and improve. If you accept, I sleep. Finance, fundraising, visitor experience, HR, marketing, public affairs, securities. And these are all areas where the museum should benchmark themselves against not just their peers in the cultural world, but against a whole range of other organizations recognized as leaders in these activities. Of course, we have to be more effective and continuously more efficient. Just because we are cultural institutions supported by public subsidy doesn't give us the right to manage our operations in an amateur way. Quite the opposite. The public subsidy we receive makes it mandatory that we manage our income professionally, spend it prudently, and we are able to demonstrate to the public who pay for us that we have a tight grip on costs. So, for example, when we mount an exhibition, I want to see a full cost budget with a price against every element that can be costed. And I want the person drawing up to that budget to know I hold them personally accountable for its delivery. Of course, I recognize that not everything worthwhile can be captured in a price. Oscar Wilde was right to act those who know the price of everything but the value of nothing. But lots of things can be costed, and if we can reduce those costs, then it frees resources to more of the really worthwhile thing, the things that are really made in building the reputation of a museum like the V&A. On a more strategic level, I also believe very strongly that museums should concentrate on their core business and outsource everything else. You tweeted that immediately. Oh, I haven't thought about it. Gosh. Our core business can be summed up like this, and this is more or less the ICOM definition. A museum is an institution sui generis on research, conservation, collecting, exhibiting, and education. These are what we do. These are the areas where we seek to be the best. Yes, of course, modern museums also offer wonderful shops and restaurants. I mean, we have a lot of people just walking in the museum, going to the shop and going back again. I think it's great. I mean, I don't complain. But anyhow, we are not, offer wonderful shops and restaurants and coffee bars and all the other things that is therefore a great visitor experience. But does this mean that museums need to be experts in catering and retail? No, it doesn't. I was in the Brooklyn Museum last week. No, it doesn't. Museums have to be run in a business-like way, but it does not mean that we are businesses. I try to run the V&A in a business-like, commercial way. But I don't think of the V&A as a business. I think of it as more as a management company that coordinates other businesses. I would say that this approach also applies to my personal management style. I don't much go for what I might call the best practice authoritarian style, but perhaps it has something to do with my German background. If you ask me, is my job about leadership or management? Then I'll say it's about both. About leadership with management. Because my definition of a good leader is also a definition of a good manager. Someone prepared to take the personal risk of saying what he thinks, of speaking up for his institution, and for the content and meaning of her or his institution. Someone who relies on, but also builds on, the knowledge and expertise of his colleagues and their teams. Someone who sees himself as a facilitator and an enabler, a primus inter pares, a first among equals. This style of leadership doesn't work in isolation. It depends very much on the existence of a management team who think in a democratic way, who are free of personal vanity, and who understand and accept the notion of personal responsibility. There's a theory that if you want to understand an institution, then you should go back to the founding fathers and see what they did in that formative years. Better than anything else, this will help us to understand why the institution is like today. I began by telling you something about the early history of the V&A. The history explains why every V&A director has to learn to ride two horses at once. Horses that want to gallop off in completely different directions. In that direction, to the collection, to scholarship, to design, to fine arts, to creativity. In this direction, to public engagement, in general, to an explicit social dimension, but also to business and commerce. The great conundrum facing all the V&A directors, and not only V&A directors, is this. Do we ride both horses with equal energy, or do we decide to favor one over the other, however gently? My choice is to combine both, the explicit practical, social and commercial dimension with scholarship and connoisseurship. This does not mean abandoning the other tradition, far from it. The collections are one of the great glories of the museum. After all, what is a museum like the V&A, without great collections, but an empty shell, a cultural husk? But if you ask me what I want the V&A to be, then this is what I will say in the end. I want the V&A to be a place that honors the past, resonates with the present, and crucially, helps to shape the future. Thank you.
If you do have a blockbuster exhibition, how do you decide whether you might make, I don't know the numbers, but 1,000 tickets a day so lots of people can see it, or 800 tickets so that the people who do see it can see the exhibition more clearly? Is there a trade-off there, and how do you approach it?
What we try to do is to offer enough space, both, real space, physical space, and a kind of intellectual space, so that everyone can enjoy the exhibition. In the case of the David Bowie show, it's relatively easy because we offer headphones for everyone, so there's a limited number for it. But what we try to do is we test it first. We know how long people want to stay in an exhibition. Más o menos. And that's the way we organize it. But it's quite difficult to control. And we've been really worried concerning the David Bowie exhibition because we have a lot of maniacs, a lot of fans coming to the David Bowie show. And you can spend hours just listening to that concerts. And fortunately, some people leave that exhibition after a while. But we have some that stay really for a very long time. And but it works.
How do you balance how much you invest in the physical museum and how much you invest in reaching people digitally?
It's still a museum. And a museum is object-based. A museum is a common ground. And that makes it so strong. It's something for our societies. And what we offer is authentic objects. So if people come to the V&A, they want to see something real. There's, for example, David Bowie's key from his apartment in Berlin in 1978. Obviously, he forgot to give it back to his landlord. Believe it or not, if you read the media, that was quoted quite often that the key is here. So it's the real thing. But we try to create a community around the world. And I think there's a kind of change going on. It's more how you inform people about what we are doing, about our, maybe not so much about the museum itself, it's more about the objects, it's more about research, it's more about conservation. And I think we will shift more and more in that direction. Then there's something new going on. I'm not sure if you're aware of. Quite a lot of successful exhibitions are now in cinemas. So they make documentaries and they show it in cinemas. And I think that's something for the future. Actually, it's a very difficult question. Being in that museum sector no, I'm not this old, but I'd say for the last 30 years, more or less. it's a completely different topic, but I think there's one problem for the museum, that they always try to catch up with what's going on with the progress of new methods in the digital way. I remember the very first time that we tried to make a digital inventory in the mid-80s. They told us it's much better to wait for another few years because there will be new technology. And this is the recommendation that I have now for the last 20, 30 years. Just wait a bit, there will be more. What is really exciting right now is that we have a lot, probably in the next 5 to 6 years, a lot of, I mean, it's just internet, TV. It's like websites, but it's television. And I think that's the other part when it's getting really exciting for us, to produce more movie parts, more documentaries, and put this on the internet.
So as I understand, V&A is run like a business and at the same time not run like a business, and it's all about conservation. So how are you in fact coming up with sort of new revenue streams? Because you're obviously constantly under pressure to keep your revenue stream strong.
I mean, first of all, it's a public institution. It's better to use the mic? It's a public institution. And if you make a ranking, a hierarchy of what is our major purpose, then I think it's education. It's being there for the public. Whatever education means, it's very broad. That's one of the reasons why I quoted Prince Albert in the beginning, because I like that idea, that this is a museum for everyone. The question is just, who is everyone today with this changing society and so on. We have no entrance fee. There's no admission. And I hope we will keep it like that. I fought very hard in Germany to do the same in the National Museums. They didn't accept it there, but I think it's perfect here. I mean, one of the reasons why I tripled our visitor numbers is because there's free admission. Till you enter the museum, till you are inside. And then the David Bowie show is an average ticket about £12, £14, something like this. So it's both, it's admission and part of the museum is free. Revenue streams, definitely more fundraising. It's getting more and more difficult because there's a lot of competition. We all look for the same donors. I'm still somehow surprised after 2 years in the UK that we always work with the same foundation and the same private donors and the same people. I think we can do slightly different, work more in an international dimension, working more with the corporate sector. I think there's still something to develop, but it's not a recipe. I mean, in times of austerity, it's difficult just to rely on fundraising. I was in Portugal yesterday, in Lisbon, and if you see those changes already in the museums in Lisbon because of the crisis, so I think it's quite good if we prepare all our cultural institutions for those tough times. Having said that, I think another possibility, or it's even more an obligation, is to be more efficient. I mean, I mentioned it several times. I don't think that we are not really working in an effective way. We have still a lot of pockets where money is sitting, and I think we can do.
The Cultural Secretary Maria Miller called for arts and cultural organisations to demonstrate their economic worth to the country recently. Do you agree with her? Because some argue that this detracts from what arts and culture is really about.
I mean, it's always difficult for me to stand still on one spot, so I really. I mean, arts and cultures we are part of that society. If you keep it as a kind of free space, it will not work. It's related to everything happening here. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I talked about the 19th century in the beginning, because we still work in that same legacy, we still somehow have the same strategies and so on. I think we expect too much from all those ideas to to involve more the creative industries. I don't know exactly what the creative industries are. Also, this kind of creative and inspiring institution, it always sounds so amazing, so just beautiful. But what is it? It sounds a little bit like you have some visions, some inspirations. Now it's about real tough business. And if you talk about design and design education in that country, one of the reasons why, I mean, I always use the same example. When I met Jonathan Ive, the designer of the iPhone first, and I tried to explain to him what the VNA is, he looked at me like, oh, poor boy. And told me that he came into the VNA when he was a child with his parents, and obviously, I mean, he didn't literally say that he wouldn't have done the iPhone without the VNA, that's not what I said. But he was pretty much inspired from the collection of the VNA and so on. So what I mean, there's a kind of contradiction. You have to have an open space, a liberal space. You have freedom for the arts, but at the same time, we are definitely part of the education for a nation, for a country in terms of their productivity. What I miss is definitely more engineering and architecture. I think that could be more part of our institutions, an institution like the VNA.
As a museum director, do you think about competition? And if you do, how do you think about it?
I like that question. No, we don't have competition. At all. We love each other. No, but I mean, it's extremely competitive. But it's the cultural field, so we don't show it. I invite you to a lunch with some colleagues in London here. No, it's highly competitive, definitely. But in a very educated way. I mean, no, honestly, we can talk about it. I know Chris Durkin, just talking about someone else who came to London like I did. I know Chris Durkin, the director of Tate Modern, for a long time. And we always had this kind of, whenever there was a chance to say something in the media. Now we are here together in the same country, we are friends, and we understand each other quite well. No, there is a competition, but I think it's a very positive one. I think, yes, it's positive, but at the same time, talking about being more efficient, more effective, it would be better to share a lot of knowledge, and we don't do it. And what I mean is not so much the intellectual part, it's more like constructions. We have a lot of corporations in terms of exhibitions or whatever, but whenever we do construction, everyone is building or developing a building on its own. So there's still a lot of knowledge that we can share with other museums, but it's a very good question.
You mentioned a few times the word supporters and lobbying as well in competition. Who do you consider to be your partners in really implementing the vision you have for the museum?
Do you somehow have the capacity to read my mind? I mean, definitely the board or part of the board, because if I don't convince the board, it will be really difficult. And then what you always need, let's say it in a very general way, what you always need is a public opinion, the media. And I'm a bit, that's some of those surprises for me coming from a different country, that what I learned here in the VNA is this kind of being extremely cautious to say something. Don't say it in the public. The media will use it. I always had that element of truth, whatever you want to hear. I'm open-minded. If you don't like it, come to see me. We can discuss it. And I don't want to change. I want to keep that way, keep that direction. So I think the media is part of it, the public is part of it, and through the media. And then in the end, the government. I mean, there's something I didn't mention because I think you will ask me, but obviously you didn't. That's what's really, I mean, talking about different parts of Europe. but it's really unusual in the UK, and that's something we really have to protect. That's the so-called arm's length principle. This kind of distance that we have to the government, politics, it's extremely important. It's completely different from the US, for example. I mean, we have this triangle situation. We have the institution, the board of trustees, and the government. I'm appointed by the government, but I report to the board. So my direct contact is the board, but if something goes completely out of control, there's always the government. So it's a very balanced situation. It's not like in the US when you have a board and it's just one-to-one. So you know about risk-taking. It's definitely more difficult if you have a board and you completely depend on that board. And you have trustees that buy themselves into the board, pay for it, and then you work with them. So, or in Germany, where we have a kind of strange situation that you will report to the government, but at the same time there's a board controlling that kind of relationship that you have. So I think the UK, I don't know how it works in Italy. Everything run by the government, probably. Berlusconi, yeah. So I think that's talking about public-private partnership, the public-private partnership construction. I mean, it's really a notion that we use too often, but it works very well in the UK, and I think it's one of the reasons why we have a golden age of cultural institutions. So it's public engagement at the same time, a commitment by the government.
As the leader of this cultural institution, I know you manage the collections and preserve the legacy of the past and plan the best for the future. But also you are the manager of all the experts in the DNA and people who know that they are the best in their areas. How do you manage those people and make sure there's a shared understanding of expectations?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate that. Because I think that's one of the major problems that I face in the V&A, because I have a completely different style. What I said in at a certain moment, this kind of primus inter pares, the first of equals, it's always a principle that I liked. I think a museum is an absolutely democratic institution. You know, that's one of the reasons why I think it's so great to have it. It's a public place. It's open for everyone. It's partly, I mean, it's the museum is an offspring of the revolutions of the 19th century. That's one of the reasons why I think it's especially this one in the 19th century. So I consider myself as being a kind of, as I said, enabler and facilitator. I try to work together with the team, but I'm definitely not the expert of medieval art. So my job is to offer a platform for, having Boris here, sorry Boris if I address it to you, who's an expert in conservation. Here's a knowledge that I definitely don't have, not at all. I've really been very bad in physics and chemistry. So my job is to give Boris and his colleagues all the platform that they need, the means, the tools to work. This is what I consider as leadership. And as I said, to protect the institution, sometimes you have to have a really you have to show muscles just to protect your team and the institution, and sometimes you have to protect it and you can't even talk about it, and we have that quite often. And it's really difficult if you can't explain something to your team at the same time you have to do it. I think the V&A had a different style before. This is what I call the authoritarian style. And this is definitely not the way I think an institution of the future will work if I tell you this is what you have to do, and I don't want to go about details.
Thank you much. I think you will join me. Thank you, Mark.